Thanks, Ben and Stephen and Judy. And good evening, everyone. You have to excuse this. I keep going to the skin specialist and less of me keeps coming home. So, last time we left Sarah in chapter 18 at her watershed moment, the tipping point from one way to another way. And in verse 15 of chapter 18, Sarah denied, saying, "I did not laugh," for she was afraid. And he said, and the Yahweh angel said, "No, but you did laugh." So she had doubted God. But all of Sarah's worlds collided at that point, right there at that time. And everything drops into place for her. She's never seen or heard of God, particularly herself, and now she finally has. So Sarah's watershed moment, there inside the tent, everything came rushing in at that very moment. The truth of Abraham's words for the last more than 30 years. God can, God will, God has, in 9 months' time to be precise. And so from that moment, she never doubts again. From this time on, her faith in God is rock solid. And this is her Peter moment, and she never goes back. They call this learning moments or learning change moments. And it's said of them that learning happens succinctly and deeply at major life-changing moments. We sometimes call them aha moments, but this is her change moment. And major learning change moments are when we learn for the first time, when we want to learn, when we try to remember something, we want to remember something, particularly when things change and when things go wrong. Life lessons are also found in the dark moments of life, and in many instances those moments change our life for the best. And I guess we've all got stories that we could say where hard times and dark times particularly we've learnt lots from. And that quote there, I've learnt more from pain than I could have ever learnt from pleasure. So this is hers. She does not forget about this time during the next 37 years of her life. She's now been given a direct revelation from God, from Yahweh himself. And she appreciates this and she moves forward and she moves to even greater heights. What does the New Testament say about Sarah? What does it say about her faith? Hebrews 11 we know so well, and we know the parts about Abraham, verse 8. By faith Abraham went out. By faith Abraham lived in tents. By faith Abraham offered up Isaac. And we know those almost off by heart, don't we? But Sarah was there, going through those things with him, wasn't she? Every step of the way, and we've said that already. But what did Sarah do on her own? Well, verse 11 of Hebrews 11 says, "Through faith also Sarah herself received strength to conceive seed and was delivered of a child when she was past age, because she judged him faithful who had promised." So we see two miracles in that one verse, verse 11 of Hebrews 11. She conceived a child. And we said last time how impossible that was for three reasons. She has been barren all her life. She is now past age, and so is Abraham. So for three reasons, conceiving a child was impossible. And the other thing that was impossible was delivering a child. So after the age of 40, 50% of carrying a child is miscarriages, and it keeps going up as age goes up. So it's impossibly dangerous for a mother and a child at her age to be delivering a baby as well. And why did she become pregnant? Because she judged him, or she judged Yahweh, faithful. He would do what he said he would do. And verse 12 of Hebrews 11 says, "Therefore sprang there even of one, and him as good as dead, so many as the stars of the sky in multitude, and as the sand which is by the seashore, innumerable." So both Abraham and Sarah understood this verse 12. They saw this son, and they saw the people that would eventually come from that son. So it wasn't about just having a son. This was about having a people. So in her own right, in Hebrews 11, she's written directly there, right alongside her husband, which is really, really nice. And we have that reassurance that she, as much as Abraham, was worthy of that faith. And faith really means trust. We have to take it beyond just belief. It's more than belief. Belief is where we start with faith, but where we end up with faith is trust. And we really have to be at that stage. And that's where their journey has taken them. From belief to leave to trust that God will do what he says. We have to be fully convicted and trust that God will do his part in his time, as Sarah got to that stage now. So both Abraham and Sarah never lost their faith. And though it waxed and waned, and at times they had great high points, and at other times they had great low points, and sometimes their faith just was not up to the task, that's just like us, isn't it? And we're like that. We have good times, and we have not so good times. And it's so comforting to know that they, as great as they were just like us. And as righteous as what God is, he wants to work with people like us, with men and women just like us, to save us. He wants a togetherness through thick and thin, and he wants a partnership, and that's what he had with Abraham and with Sarah. Of course, God is the higher partner in the partnership, but what we see with them is that he's working tirelessly to bring us to him. Then in chapter 19, we have the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, which the angels had discussed with Abraham back in chapter 16, which we don't want to talk about that. But then we go on and we get to chapter 20, and we have some repetition. Now, we talked about this before as being part of the chiasm. So chapter 20, I'll just read out verse 1 and 2. It says, "From there Abraham journeyed toward the territory of the Negev and lived between Kadesh and Shur, and he sojourned in Gerar. And Abraham said of Sarah his wife, 'She is my sister.' And Abimelech, king of Gerar, sent and took Sarah." So we have a very similar story to where we went before down in Egypt in chapter 12. They're two parts of the chiasm. So before we had Pharaoh and the lie, and Sarah nearly in the arms of Pharaoh. Now we have Abimelech and the lie. This time in chapter 20, there's not much dialogue. It's done all fairly quick. It's a quick chapter. And we know the essence is, time is of the essence here in chapter 20, because in 9 months' time, Sarah's going to have a baby. This time that they are in Gerar, which is well into Philistine territory, Perhaps they're there. We might be wondering why they're down in Gera. Perhaps it's to get away from Sodom and Gomorrah, because remember, Sodom and Gomorrah has just been destroyed. There could have been some people fleeing. There could have been all sorts of things. And they've moved south-west to get away from that area. She's 89 years old, and she's still extremely attractive. And if we do the maths again, she's going to live to 127. That means that she's the equivalent of 59 in today's age cycle that we have. Perhaps her looks have been rejuvenated somewhat in preparation of the birth and motherhood. Perhaps Abraham has been rejuvenated a little as well because of fatherhood. We remember that Sarah was extremely good looking always and goodly inside and out. So perhaps it's no surprise that Abimelech wants her for his wife again. And you might be thinking, well, is this the same story as chapter 12? And some people have said, well, it is the same story. And there are similarities. So these here are the similarities. If you look at them, they're almost identical. So we have a leader of a people. There's the lie being told about their relationship, that she is my sister. There's lust for the beauty, taken for a wife. God comes in to solve the problem, and Sarah didn't get touched. Here we have the fact that there were not similarities as well. So there's differences. Abraham was paid handsomely. So Pharaoh bought Sarah. That's how he was seeing that. This time Sarah is just taken, it says. And so Abimelech is also spoken to by God a fair bit. Abimelech pleads his innocence. Sarah is also reproved a bit in this chapter. Abraham is paid handsomely for Abimelech to be rid of them, in a way. And then Abraham has to pray for the situation to be healed. So again, he fell back on something that he had said before. She is my sister. So this is a bad on-the-fly response. And it is a on-the-fly response because he said exactly that before. And even though it was 30 years ago, he's been there. He's done that. And it's the same. And we have to ask the question, well, how many of us learn lessons really well the first time? And we don't, do we? We seem to have to learn the lesson again and again and again, often, sadly. And when people panic, so it's all right having faith when things are going well, but to have faith in tricky situations or tough situations is hard, and that's when we respond on the fly. And it's usually not a response that is God-centred or we pray about it. It's usually something that we try and fix ourselves, like we have done in the past. Someone once said to me, I'm surprised that the things that affected me when I was young still cause me problems now. And he was 80 when he said that. And so verse 2 of chapter 20, after the she is my sister, they seized Sarah and took her away. And that's what the words literally mean there, if you look them up. So this wasn't a pleasant time that Sarah is now facing at the age of 89. Verse 3, and God came to Abimelech in a dream by night and said to him, behold, you're a dead man because of the woman whom you have taken, for she is another man's wife. So God intervenes again like he did with Pharaoh. This time it says you're a dead man. God is not messing around now. This is a dire situation if we think about the timing. God was having nothing to do with Abimelech getting close to Sarah. So he uses those words, and that's exactly what it means. She is a man's wife. The words Ish and Isha are used there. Verse 6 of chapter 20, then God said to him in a dream, yes, I know that you've done this in the integrity of your heart, because Abimelech pleaded that I didn't know, I was innocent. You can't pick on me for that. And God says, it was I who kept you from sinning against me. Therefore, I did not let you touch her. Which begs the question about how often do we do things and we have help from God behind the scenes that we know nothing of. So here in this situation, God kept Abimelech from her, and we know that God, through his angels and through Christ, worked in our lives as well, behind the scenes, and there's probably lots that we don't know that happen to keep us safe and well at times. So Abraham then is justly rebuked by Abimelech. Abraham has had this code of practice for 30 years, but it's not a good one. This she is my sister thing is just, really, it's just not having enough faith. Again, here at this time, at this late stage in their development. God has promised the child, and fear at this point is just not trusting God enough. Back when it was Pharaoh, and we looked at that situation, it was pretty much all Abraham's fault. But this time, if you look at the record carefully, it seems a little bit more balanced. It almost seems that both of them are involved equally in this. And verse 16, we have a bit of a hint to this. Verse 16 says, Abimelech said to Sarah, behold, I have given your brother 1,000 pieces of silver. It's a sign of your innocence in the eyes of all who are with you, and before everyone you are vindicated. Seems as if there's a little bit of sarcasm there, that he's just been told that she's another man's wife, that she's Abraham's wife, I'm keeping you from her, and he says to Sarah, I've given your brother 1,000 pieces of silver. Seems more than just a little bit of sarcasm, it seems like a lot. So the word brother is used there to describe Abraham. The 1,000 pieces of silver in Song of Solomon chapter 8 is the price for a bride. And so Abimelech pays that price to Abraham. Quite an interesting thing. And in this, Abimelech comes out fairly good as being quite an honourable person, apart from the fact that he seized her. Apart from that, he's fine. Verse 17, then Abraham prayed to God, and God healed Abimelech, and also healed his wife and female slaves so that they bore children. For Yahweh had closed all the wombs of the house of Abimelech because of Sarah, Abraham's wife. So everyone in the house, I don't know how that would have been found out or what that was, how that was displayed, but somehow they knew that all the wombs were closed in that household. So this is a really close call. There's a lot of urgency and drama in these chapters here, because remember we said everything from chapter 17 to chapter 21 all happens in the space of 12 months. And so here that time frame is just getting tighter and tighter. Now, there is some thought that perhaps this is the time that Sarah's womb is opened as well. It would fit the story. Abraham prays for perhaps her womb as well as the wombs of the rest of the house to be opened. And she is healed too. And the very next chapter that Judy read for us, verse 1 says, "The Lord visited Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did to Sarah as he had promised. And Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age at the time of which God had spoken to him." It looks as if there's a second visit, but I don't believe that's the case. If we look carefully at it all and we put all of the record together, we had some time frames mentioned in chapter 17, we had some time frames mentioned in chapter 18, and it was from this time you will have a son. There's nothing mentioned here, and quite often the Hebrew language talks about things that have happened in the past like they're happening right now. So it should be really the Lord had visited Sarah. We see this in Genesis 1, 2 and 3, where it has happened in the past. Even in Genesis 12, it happens like that as well. So the time frames mentioned would lead us to believe that she is already in the early stages of pregnancy while she's there in the house of Abimelech. The Torah also supports this. The Torah believes that Sarah became pregnant at the time of the visitation of the angels to the tent in Mamre. Yahweh was there, Yahweh angel was there, the other two angels were there, chapter 18. And the Torah even suggests that there is some text missing. When they look at the Hebrew text, they think that there's some text that's missing, and they think that the three angels went into the tent to talk to Sarah when she laughed. And it's not in our record. So that's what the Jews believe. So that when she laughed, they went to talk to her about that situation. So that's when they believe that's what happened. And from the time periods that are all mentioned, I believe that's the case as well, that this is quite a short time frame and that she's already well on the way. So back in chapter 17, we had 12 months was mentioned. Chapter 18, 9 months was mentioned. But whatever is the case, fertility has been the big issue all the way along. The moon god Sin, the fertility god, wasn't able to do anything back in her, but God now is able to do that he couldn't. So Sarah really shines now from this time forward, or from even the tent. She now becomes a mother, the matriarch of the nation of Israel, and the matriarch of the gospel, because the blessing was to all nations of the earth. So she's the matriarch of what we are doing right here, sitting here, this belief that we have through Christ. So separately, we've seen them reach tragic, life-altering spiritual lows. Separately, we've also seen them reaching amazing heights, watershed moments, spiritual highs, and together we've seen at the most crucial time, at this time, they have momentarily lapsed again right at a crucial moment. And I think that's amazing, because sometimes you find that at the greatest spiritual highs that you have, you're hit with quite a low. I don't know if you guys have found that, but I certainly have. When you think that you're having a very high spiritual time, you think, this is great, this is where I need to be all the time, something happens and it brings you back down to our humanness. So together we're about to see them reach great spiritual heights, and we see them as heirs together, and they are the equal of each other. We've had this back and forward in their journey of faith, and it's great to see. Such a fantastic story. I think this is a great story. So back in chapter 21, verse 3, it says, Abraham called the name of his son, who was born to him, whom Sarah bore to him, Isaac. He's finally got it, Isaac. And verse 5, Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him, and she is 90. And Sarah said, God has made laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh over me. And this is a fantastic spot, I think. Isaac means he laughs, or happiness, or joy. And we can't imagine the heart-wrenching joy they have here at this time. When you spend years in the wilderness, you certainly appreciate good times, and that's what they've been doing. You certainly appreciate the good times when you've had lots of bad. Anything that takes a long time to come is always better, and this baby has been a whole lifetime coming. When we think of the laughter with Isaac, our minds are immediately drawn to Sarah in the tent, laughing. But this whole story is about laughter. So we had Abraham laughing in chapter 17 as he understands where his faith should be, his watershed moment, chapter 17. We had Sarah's laughter in the tent. Sarah laughing here with the joy of this birth. And laughter for the whole world to hear the gospel message, because the gospel message really should be about hope and joy. And for us too, it should be that hope and joy and a smile of faith and the laughter of understanding that we've got something that God is offering us in the future that's coming. And so on the slide before this one, we had, I'll just go back there, Abraham with the little bundle of joy. And I think mothers get a really special time with babies and that, with the joy that's there. And fathers have to understand that as well and get this similar joy out of little ones. Verse 7, Sarah said, who would have said to Abraham and Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age. So we sense the happiness here in her words, but again there's more meaning in this than what's just there, because she uses again the word children. She's used it before with Hagar, now she's using it again. It's a plural. It's the builder of a family. That's what she's seeing. And so she's seeing way into the future with this great joy as the mother of a multitude. So we said it before about Hebrews 11 verse 11, that by faith Sarah herself received power to conceive. The conceive word there is laying down a foundation. So she understood the future. She was building a foundation. So this son Isaac was not just one boy, one baby that we might have today. She understood that he was a foundation of things hoped for, the evidence of things not yet seen. And this is a real pinnacle of her faith, that she saw way into the future with that. Now, God says of life in Ecclesiastes 7, in the day of prosperity be joyful, but in the day of adversity consider. Life is a bit like snakes and ladders. In happiness, we have to enjoy that and ride up the ladder. But in sadness, and we go down the snake, we need to think about that. And sadly, in this story, there's a snake who wasn't quite sharing in the laughter time like Abraham and Sarah were. Hagar, the Egyptian, again. And it reminds me of a rather depressive, cynical saying which says, be happy. Things could be worse. And I did, and they were. Hagar would very much have had a sneer in her heart at this particular time. And so did her son. In verse 9, Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, laughing. Now this is laughing of a different kind. So it's still laughing, but this one is mocking. And Sarah's watching this situation and something's not quite right. Here we have Sarah's heart telling her that there's something wrong with this situation and she wasn't happy with it. So the word laughter there means to make sport of or jest or laugh at. So it's a very different word to the name Isaac. This is sledging, and it's been suggested by commentators that highly probable that he was jesting perhaps about the birth of Isaac. That perhaps he wasn't Abraham's child, he was Abimelech's child. So that is something that is talked about by commentators, which is a terrible innuendo. The timing would have worked out pretty well. And it's a bit like the accusation towards our Lord and his illegitimate birth. There's a quote by Arthur Conan Doyle. Does anyone know who that is? Sherlock Holmes? Yes. I have seen too much not to know the impression of a woman may be more valuable than the conclusion of an analytical reasoner. And I think that's often true. Problems. We sometimes have to face them. Sometimes we have to stand up to them. Sometimes we have to overcome them. But sometimes you have to send them away. Sometimes in life, problems are just too big and too big for us to deal with. And they'll wreck our lives if they're allowed to stay with us. And Hagar was one of these problems, unfortunately. We wrestle because we think we should be able to surmount all our problems, but sometimes the better part of valour is to get rid of them. And Sarah is also worried about the safety of Isaac, the 3-year-old with the wild ass of a man. So that picture before is probably fairly right, with Ishmael being so much older than Isaac. Was he safe to be around? Verse 10, she said to Abraham, "Cast out this slave woman with her son, for the son of this slave woman shall not be heir with my son Isaac." So Sarah takes the lead here with this boy. No mocker was going to share the inheritance, and she was very clear about this. And as a mother, she was a very righteous woman. And so she's seeing right into the future, even here at this point, that Isaac's going to be the heir of all of this down to Christ and beyond. And this mocker was not going to share that. Is she being too hard again, like she was perhaps before when she sent Hagar away? Well, this quote tells us no, she wasn't. Galatians 4, Paul tells us, "Now you, brothers, like Isaac, are children of promise. But just as at that time he who was born according to the flesh persecuted him who was born according to the Spirit," so that's this situation that it's talking about, this mocking, "so also it is now. But what does the Scripture say? Cast out the slave woman and her son, for the son of the slave woman shall not inherit with the son of the free woman. So, brothers, we are not the children of the slave, but of the free." Hagar was in no way a spiritual woman. She would not have comprehended God's way ever. Sarah's not being precious or whingy. She is completely in line with God's thoughts. She takes the lead and takes charge of this problem in their family. And Paul picks up on that and says that she's doing the right thing. So children of promise, like Isaac, children of the free woman. But this was sad for Abraham. If we think about his situation, it says there, on account of his son. Again, we see that anguish that he's got. And as a father, he would have. Ishmael's his son. So rightly so, he's concerned about this situation. And this is tough for him to deal with. And he's remembering as well the last time that he listened to Sarah and sent away Hagar. Hagar came back and she's been there ever since. So Abraham must have put this to God in prayer this time, because in verse 12, God said to Abraham, "Do not be displeased because of the boy and because of your slave woman. Whatever Sarah says to you, do as she tells you, for through Isaac shall your offspring be named." So here God's blessing is here for Sarah. God again, in his kindly and compassionate way, intervenes for Abraham to say, don't worry about this situation. I've got it under control, but listen to her. Listen to her. And the word listen means hear intelligently. God's answer to Abraham is, she's right, Abraham. She's doing the right thing. And this is the second time that God intervenes in Abraham's life to tell him that same thing, that she's right, listen to her. This is a really amazing part of the story, I think, because it's a big lesson for all of us that no one, not men, not women, have a ticker on who's the most spiritual one in the family all the time. Sometimes it's one, sometimes it's the other. And we have seen these two back and forth their whole lives. Their travelling lives are travelling faith lives as well. We have to hear intelligently. So whatever we're listening to, we just don't send it off. We listen to it. We think about it. Sometimes we act on those things, and sometimes we don't, but we have to hear intelligently and work out what would be best for God, always. And it doesn't matter whether it's husband or wife, we have to do that as what's best for God. And I guess we also have to learn to speak intelligently too. Many of the Proverbs talk about speaking, and it's equally important to speak carefully and to speak up when it's important and let the things that don't matter not matter. So don't sweat the small stuff, but certainly, as Sarah did here, we have to make a point about the things that do matter as far as God's concerned. Spiritually, Sarah has picked up on the son being the foundation, the heir, the future salvation, and she was 100% right. So Hagar, the Egyptian, is sent away. So they go through the wilderness of Beersheba, and then in verse 21, he, which is Ishmael, lived in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother took him a wife from the land of Egypt. So family traits were going to continue on through Ishmael because of another Egyptian. So Beersheba was where they were living at the time, and she went off through the wilderness of Beersheba. And it is a bit of a wilderness around Beersheba. I don't know if anyone's seen the movies about what happened at Beersheba in the First World War with the horses, the light horse brigade. It's a fairly desert area there. And so Abraham and Sarah lived there for a number of years into chapter 22. So chapter 22 is the story of the sacrifice of Isaac. And if I just go back a slide to here, and I don't have the pointer, but it's a little bit blurry. But they're down in Beersheba there. Ishmael's gone down to the wilderness of Paran, down near the Sinai area. They're in that green section in the middle of the top circle. And then we've got this story about the sacrifice of Isaac. And Isaac, at this stage, is around about 20 to 25 years of age. We always think of him as a boy. He's not a boy. These slides here in a minute are going to have a boy. Sort of erase that from your vision. Some people even think that perhaps he was 33. So Sarah, we know, doesn't feature at all in the story of the offering of Isaac. But we need to mention a couple of things. Verse 2 says, "Take your son," chapter 22, "your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you." So it's a long way that they had to travel. So when Abraham first heard these words to God, do you think he might have looked like this? I think perhaps maybe. Or did he look like this? Or did he look like this? Or did he look like this? Would have been pretty heart-wrenching. So ignore the boy, 20-ish, 25-ish. The situation would have been dire for him to hear after so long of wanting this boy. So whatever way he looked, it would have been terrible. After all they'd been through, and God is asking for this. It was such a devastating thing. But we have to remember that Sarah was around the place as well. She would have known what was going on. She would have known the situation. And she would have seen them leave. To her, standing to the side, the pain and the anguish would have been just as much for her as they would have been for Abraham. Maybe even more so. This is the barren one's son. What a test for her as well. And Sarah would have been waiting the whole time for days for them to come back. So then we have chapter 23. Verse 1 of chapter 23, Sarah lived 127 years. These were the years of the life of Sarah. So there's a big jump here in the story. So we had all that condensed 1 year for 5 chapters, and now we see 1 chapter's gone and 20 odd years have gone past. And Sarah died at Kirjath Arba, which is Hebron, in the land of Canaan, and Abraham went in to mourn for Sarah and to weep for her. So Hebron, so we're back at Hebron. Earlier we were at Hebron, we said that it was her spot, just at the top of the arrow there. It's a long way from Beersheba. Sarah's the only biblical woman whose age is recorded at her death. She never got to be a grandma. And even though Isaac was now 37 years old, he's not even married. That's in the next chapter. So Hebron means fellowship. Fellowship was Sarah's happy place. Their names were changed here. The angels visited Sarah here, plain of Mamre, Hebron, and told her of the birth, and probably Isaac was born here. So this place has got fond memories for her, and it's fitting that she would end her days here as well. And the Hittites said to Abraham in verse 6, "Hear us, my Lord, Thou art a mighty prince among us. In the choice of our sepulchres bury thy dead. None of us shall withhold from thee his sepulchre, but that thou mayest bury thy dead. So the mighty prince, Abraham, the prince with God, wants to bury his princess. Verse 19, Abraham buried Sarah his wife in the cave of the field of Machpelah, east of Mamre, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. And later Abraham was buried there as well. And as we've got on the slide there, and we know Rebekah and Isaac were buried there, Leah and Jacob were buried there. So it was a very, very important place. And then chapter 24. Now Abraham was old, verse 1, well advanced in years, and Yahweh had blessed Abraham in all things. Chapter 24, verse 1 is sort of like a bookend to chapter 12, verse 2. There was the blessing, chapter 12, verse 2, and here's sort of the summary of that. The Lord had blessed Abraham in all the things that he had. Blessed in all things. So chapter 24 is a very long chapter and very, very detailed. Again, the story slows down for one particular thing. It was Abraham sending Eliezer to get a wife for Isaac. And you might think, why is it so detailed? Because Sarah had instructed Abraham that that's what he was to do. They were not to take a wife from the Canaanites. They had to go back and get a wife for Isaac to be sought from their relations in Haran. And so that's the story of chapter 24. So she had an influence then, even after her death, upon her son and upon the marriage of her son, which is really nice. In verse 67 of chapter 24, then Isaac brought her into the tent of Sarah, his mother, and took Rebekah, and she became his wife, and he loved her. So Isaac was comforted after his mother's death. That's a beautiful verse, isn't it? When you take it after what we've been talking about, his mother's tent was still there. This is 3 years later. Nomadic lifestyle was all about recycling and reusing and being economic. But her tent is still there. And he's still needing to be comforted 3 years later. It's a very fitting testimony to his beautiful mother. There was obviously a great love between the two of them, mother and only son. And so he moved into Sarah's tent with Rebekah. Abraham lived another 38 years after Sarah. He was 175 years old when he died and was buried next to her in Hebron. So together in life, together in death. Sometimes Sarah followed, sometimes she led. They were really heirs together. Through both the Old Testament and the New, we've seen, and I've got a list here, I'll just read out. We've seen her strength of character and her resilience. We've seen her humility. We've seen her exceptional beauty inside and out. We've seen her meek and quiet spirit. We've seen her love and respect. We've seen the journey of togetherness with her husband. We've seen her ability to look way into the future. We see her motherly love and care and protection. She's an absolutely beautiful woman. But the New Testament takes her even further than this, because it speaks very eloquently of her status as matriarch. So we've seen the story so far. But the New Testament takes us, I think, even beyond Abraham, the patriarch. And I'd like to finish with just a few of these thoughts very quickly. So in the New Testament, we've already looked at Galatians 4. Galatians 4 has a whole argument from Paul, almost the whole chapter. And I don't want us to turn there, but I just want you to have a look at this slide. Because what this slide is telling us is, okay, you're children of Abraham. That's great. And so Paul is saying, but I want to tell you something. If you're children of Abraham, that can be like a two-way bet. That can be 50-50. Because if you're children of Abraham, you could be like Ishmael. So these words are all, this is the crux of Galatians 4. This is how it plays out if you read it through. So if you're Abraham's seed, then you could be Ishmael, Hagar, and these are lined up verse for verse with each other the whole way through. It could be Ishmael or Isaac. You could be Hagar or Sarah. You could be bondage or free. You could be flesh or promise. You could be Mount Sinai or Mount Zion, Jerusalem. You could be one that answereth to the slave owner, or you could be a free woman. You could be in bondage with your children. You could be mother of us all. So Paul's argument goes step by step the whole way through. That's there. It's worth having a read sometimes, because what he's saying is, well, if you're Abraham's, it's a two-way bet. You could be either. But if you're Sarah's, you're coming down that line. And so he's placing there the importance of Sarah as being the mother of us all. So he elevates her at this point. The next one, John 8. Jesus' words in John 8. Jesus talks to the Pharisees that thought that they were Abraham's children and said to Christ, will we be Abraham's children? And this was in Matthew as well, as I can make children to Abraham out of these stones. But in the John 8 record, it says, and from this, they felt that they were talking to Christ as if they had a ticket straight to the kingdom because they are Abraham's children. And Jesus tells them, yes, they were Abraham's children. But he says to them, you're still in your sin, because he knew that their murderous intent. They were servants. They were outside. You want to kill me. But you could be Abraham's children on the other side, on the Sarah side, where you have the word of God. You become his disciples. You listen to truth. You become free. You become in the house and you do the works of Abraham. So he paints that. Jesus Christ paints that same thing in John 8. Then Paul again in Romans 9 has another huge area where he spells it out again really clearly. Just because you are the children of Abraham doesn't mean anything. In Isaac you shall be called. For Sarah shall have a son. We have to be children of Sarah, not just children of Abraham. So that's his point in Romans 9. And again, it's a whole section that you really need to read through quietly to do it justice. And just to explain it there, this is Paul's argument in Romans 9. And we know Paul to have these very logical answers that he steps through. And here he says, okay, Abraham, yes, but Hagar or Sarah, flesh or promise, Ishmael or Isaac. And then he goes on to say, in Isaac shall you be called, through Rebekah. And again, there's a split. So Paul says, yes, there's another split there. You could be Esau or Jacob. So Paul is trying to get us to realise that through Sarah and beyond, we have a need to keep in that faith, not just through Abraham. So, Paul is really saying we've got a great lineage, and we have to be aware of those distinct directions, those distinctions. So he gives us this amazing allegory. Children of Abraham is okay, but there is only one line to salvation through Christ, and that's through Sarah. So this is not lowering Abraham's status at all, but rather it's lifting our thoughts about Sarah and how good she is in that line. You don't get to just be any woman married to the father of many nations, to the friend of God, he's called in James 2, and the father of us all in Romans 4. But if Abraham was the father of the faithful, then surely Sarah is the mother of the faithful. And we have to see her that way. There's quite a scriptural precedence to call our God Yahweh Elohim of Abraham, Isaac and Israel. But is there room also then, especially for sisters, to be able to pray to Yahweh Elohim of Sarah? I think that perhaps there is. And our last slide, Isaiah 51, finishes off the whole story of Sarah really, really beautifully. Abraham and Sarah, heirs together. Sarah had a hard life, not a particularly joyful one at times, until she had Isaac. And Isaiah 51 is really good, how it just says, "Listen to me, you who pursue righteousness, you that seek the Lord. Look unto the rock from which you were hewn, and the quarry from which you were dug. Look to Abraham your father, and to Sarah that bore you. For I called him alone, and blessed him, and multiplied him. For the Lord comforts Zion," which is Sarah. "He will comfort all her waste places, and he will make her wilderness like Eden, and her desert like the garden of the Lord. Joy and gladness will be found in her, thanksgiving and the voice of song." So through Sarah, each one of us here tonight has the hope of being part of that place of laughter, joy and gladness.